Her sister was supposed to walk down that aisle. But when their mother found out the groom lived alone on a mountain with no money and no name worth keeping, she dragged Vivian away and pushed Nicole forward instead. The daughter she never bragged about. The girl she kept in the background of every photograph. Nicole walked toward a stranger in a dress that belonged to someone else, her hands cold, her heart hammering. And when the vows were spoken and the chapel fell silent, the man beside her turned gray eyes like a winter storm, jaw sharp as cut stone, and he did not whisper. He screamed it into the silence so every soul in that chapel heard. You are Mine. Now, welcome to the channel. Tell us where you are listening from. The morning of the wedding arrived the way bad news always does, quietly, and all at once. Nicole Bates stood in a broom closet at the back of St. Aldrich's Chapel, wrestling herself into a dress that had never been meant for her body. It was ivory silk and Belgian lace, fitted 3 months ago to her sister Vivian's measurements by a seamstress who had smiled and called Vivian a vision. The dress fit Nicole the way a borrowed life fits, pulling across the shoulders, pooling at the hem, wrong in every direction that mattered. She had no mirror. There was no room for one. There was barely room for her. Through the thin wooden wall, she could hear her mother's voice. Diana Bates did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. Her words carried the way cold carries. Not loudly, but into everything. This is the sensible choice, Diana was saying into her phone, her tone smooth and unhurried. The voice she used when she had already decided and was merely informing the universe of its instructions. I am not sending Vivian to the middle of nowhere to marry a man who doesn't exist on paper. Marcus checked. There is no Sheffield wealth. There is a mountain, a few hundred acres of timber, and rumors. No daughter of mine is going to disappear into the woods for a rumor. A pause. The sound of a heel on stone. Nicole will go. She's the practical one. Nicole pressed her palm flat against the closet wall and breathed through her nose. The practical one. She had been called that her whole life, in the same tone one might say the sensible shoes, functional, reliable, nothing you choose if you had options. She was 26 years old, and she had been an option of last resort since the morning her father, Robert Bates, had a heart attack in his study and died before the ambulance reached the end of the street. She had been 12. Vivian had been 14. Diana had been 41 and had made her calculations before the flowers on the casket had wilted. Vivian got the piano lessons and the modeling portfolio and the carefully curated future. Nicole got the practical label and a bedroom at the end of the hall with a window that faced a wall. There was one thing that had come to her from her father's side of things. Not money. Diana had found all of that and redirected it efficiently. Not his study or his books or his photographs, which had been boxed and stored somewhere Nicole had never been able to locate. Just a ring he had worn on his right hand every day of his life. A silver band stamped with the head of a wolf, worn smooth where his thumb had worried it, which Diana had removed before the funeral and never returned, saying it was not appropriate for a child to have. Nicole had nothing of her father's. She had only the suspicion, stubborn and unverifiable, that he had been more than Diana ever told her. She tugged the dress straight across her hips, pushed the closet door open, and walked toward the chapel entrance. The cold hit her immediately. October in the northern counties was not gentle, and the smell of candle wax and old stone settled over her like a held breath. She did not look at Diana, who was already seated in the front pew with her phone face down in her lap and an expression of composed satisfaction that Nicole recognized as the face she wore when a problem had been efficiently managed. She did not look at Vivian, who was sitting 3 rows back in a cream cashmere coat, sunglasses pushed up into her blonde hair, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. Nicole looked at the aisle, the candles lining it, the altar at the end of it, lit from the high chapel windows in the gray October light, and the man standing there. He was not what she had been led to expect. Diana had said mountain hermit and no name worth keeping, and Nicole had constructed, without meaning to, an image of someone diminished, someone scruffy and defeated and easy to overlook, the way she was easy to overlook, both of them discarded at the same altar by a woman who only valued what she could display. The man at the altar was not diminished. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who were not thinking about how they looked. His hair was dark and slightly long, curling just past his collar. His jaw was sharp, shadowed with a day or two of stubble, and his posture was the posture of something that had never once in its life considered flinching. His eyes found her the moment she appeared in the doorway. Gray. Storm gray, deep and still and absolutely certain. He looked at her the way no one had ever looked at her. Not like she was a solution. Not like she was the practical option. Not like she was the one they sent when the one they wanted wasn't available. He looked at her like she was the only person in the building. Like the chapel, the candles, the cold October light, and the 30-odd guests had all been assembled for the single purpose of delivering her to this exact point in space and time, and he had been standing here patiently, knowing she would arrive. Nicole's feet kept moving because her feet did not know what her brain was processing. The ceremony was brief. The priest's words washed over her in the way formal language does when your entire nervous system is occupied elsewhere. She heard herself say "I do" in a voice that came out steadier than she felt. She heard him say the same, low and unhurried, each word placed with deliberate weight, like stones laid to build something permanent. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The chapel exhaled. And then Jon Sheffield, alpha of the Ashwood pack, though she did not know that yet, turned to face her fully. The storm-gray eyes traveled over her with a focus that made her feel pinned and seen simultaneously. Seen in a way that had nothing to do with the dress that didn't fit or the hair she'd pinned up hastily in the closet or the fact that she was the backup, the substitute, the practical one. He leaned toward her. His lips came close to her ear, and Nicole felt the warmth of him like standing near a fire. He ran hot, she registered, with some distant analytical part of her brain, impossibly warm for a cold chapel in October. And then he pulled back just far enough to look her in the eyes. He did not whisper. His voice rang across the chapel, low and absolute and carrying to every corner, to every pew, to the priest and the guests and the floral arrangements and the high stone ceiling and Diana Bates sitting rigid in the front row with her phone face down in her lap. "You are mine now." Not a threat. Not a declaration of ownership. Something older than that. Something that sounded, to the part of Nicole that was still her father's daughter, like a door being unlocked from the outside by someone who had been standing on the other side of it for a very long time. Diana's face had gone the color of old wax. Vivian's sunglasses had slipped off her hair and into her hands, and she was staring. The 30-odd guests were very, very still. Nicole looked at this stranger she had just married. This tall, dark, impossible stranger with storm-gray eyes who had screamed her claim across a stone chapel like a man who had been waiting to say it, and she felt something answer in her chest. Something that had no name. Something that had been quiet her entire life and was, for the first time, not quiet. Outside, somewhere in the forest that pressed against the chapel walls on three sides, something howled. Jon Sheffield's eyes did not move from hers. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more patient than a smile. The expression of a man who has been waiting long enough that he has learned to be still, and who is watching the waiting finally end. He knew, Nicole thought. He knew before I walked in. He knew before today. The guests began to murmur. Diana had risen from her pew. The priest was clearing his throat. Nicole Bates, the practical one, the background daughter, the girl in the wrong dress at the wrong altar for the wrong reasons, looked at the man she had just married. And she didn't run. This is the story of Nicole Bates, and the alpha who built a mountain fortress and waited 2 years for the world to deliver her to his door. Stay with us. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. The black SUV pulled out of St. Aldrich's gravel lot and headed north, and that was the last Nicole saw of her mother. A pale figure in a cream coat standing very still beside a hired car, watching them go with an expression Nicole had never seen on her face before. Took her a moment to identify it. Then she had it. Diana Bates was afraid. Nicole filed that away and turned to face the road. Jon drove the way he did everything, without apparent effort, one hand on the wheel, his attention seeming to belong to the forest rather than the traffic. The trees thickened almost immediately once they left the town limits, pines pressing close on both sides until the road felt less like a road and more like a seam, the forest barely tolerating their passage. The last of the afternoon light was falling sideways through the branches, turning everything amber and shadow. He didn't speak. Neither did she for a while. She watched the trees and thought about her father's ring. The wolf's head worn smooth. The way Diana had lifted it from his hand at the funeral home with the brisk efficiency of a woman collecting her own property. She thought about the sigil above every doorway she had seen in the chapel, carved into the stone lintels, old and dark and certain. She had noticed it on the way in, registered it as decorative, and moved on because she had other things occupying her nervous system at the time. Now she turned it over in her mind and felt the shape of something she couldn't yet name. "You knew," she said, not a question. She had decided before they reached the main road that she wasn't going to ask questions she already knew the answers to. "You knew she would switch us." Jon's eyes found hers in the rearview mirror. Storm gray in the fading light, utterly steady. "I knew before the arrangement was made," he said. His voice was the same as it had been in the chapel, unhurried, each word carrying its full weight. "I needed it to be you." Nicole looked at the side of his face. The sharp jaw, the dark hair curling at his collar. The absolute absence of apology in his posture. "The poverty rumors," she said, "were deliberate. You let her believe. I let her believe what she needed to believe to make the choice I needed her to make." He said it without cruelty and without satisfaction. Simply as fact. "Your mother is a woman who optimizes. I gave her a variable to optimize against." Nicole was quiet for a moment. Outside, the forest deepened. The road had narrowed to a single lane, and the mountain was visible now ahead of them. Dark against the graying sky, enormous and unhurried, the kind of geographical feature that makes human urgency feel briefly absurd. "She'll be furious when she finds out," Nicole said. "Yes. That doesn't concern you."
No.
She almost laughed. She pressed her fingers together in her lap instead and watched the mountain grow. The gates appeared without warning. Iron, tall, set into a stone wall that disappeared into the treeline on both sides as though the forest had grown around it over centuries and decided to stay. Lanterns burned amber on either side of the entrance, and as the SUV slowed and the gates swung inward, Nicole leaned forward in her seat. The Sheffield estate emerged from the trees the way a held breath releases, all at once, and with considerable force. It was not a ruin. It was not a hermit's outpost or a crumbling inheritance or anything else Diana's sources had suggested. It was a fortress. Dark stone, 3 stories, wide windows that caught the last of the dusk light and threw it back warm and amber. A broad covered entrance, iron sconces burning on either side of the doors, a courtyard of fitted stone where the SUV rolled to a quiet stop. Behind the house, the mountain rose, vast and black against the early stars, and Nicole had the distinct and irrational impression that it was watching. She got out of the car without waiting for Jon and stood in the courtyard with her hands at her sides and her too long dress gathered in one fist to keep it off the stone. Above the front doors, carved deep into the lintel, was the wolf's head sigil, identical to her father's ring, worn smooth with the same age, the same absolute certainty in the lines of it. The doors opened. A woman stepped out, tall, dark-eyed, with the kind of stillness that Nicole recognized as trained rather than natural. She looked at Nicole with an expression that was not surprising. It was a relief. She inclined her head in a slight bow. "We have been waiting a long time, Luna." Nicole did not correct her. The word settled against her sternum like something warm, and the strangest part, the part she would think about later, lying awake in an unfamiliar room with the mountain dark outside the window, was that it didn't feel wrong. It felt, with a certainty she had no language for yet, exactly like the truth. The estate had a rhythm Nicole didn't recognize at first because she had never lived anywhere that had one. Not a schedule she understood. Diana had run the Bates household on strict schedules, but something older and more organic than that. The estate breathed. Fires were lit in the mornings before she came downstairs. Meals appeared at the long kitchen table at intervals that seemed calibrated to appetite rather than the clock. Doors opened as she approached them. Not because someone was rushing to perform a service, but because someone was simply always there, attentive and unhurried and asking nothing in return. The pack, she was learning, did not behave like staff. They behaved like people who had been told something important about her and were waiting, patiently, for her to figure it out herself. It unsettled her deeply. She kept waiting for the invoice, for the moment someone would appear with a clipboard and enumerate what all this warmth was going to cost her. It was the reflection of a woman who had spent 14 years receiving kindness only as a prelude to obligation. The invoice didn't come. She stopped sleeping well, which was how she ended up in the library at 2 in the morning on her 4th night, working her way through a leather-bound volume of Ashwood Pack history that was dense enough to be genuinely soporific and fascinating enough that she kept reading anyway. She made it to 1887 before her eyes gave up on her. She woke to warmth across her shoulders. Jon's jacket, dark wool, smelling of pine and cold stone and something underneath that she had no name for yet. She was still in the chair, the book open across her forearms, and she was alone in the library except for the fire burned down to embers and the specific quality of stillness that means someone was recently here and chose to leave quietly. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled the jacket closer and went back to sleep. He found her at breakfast. She waited until Sarah had left the kitchen, and then she said, "Why did you scream it?" Jon looked up from his coffee. He had the stillness of someone who was never surprised by questions, only by the timing of them. "Because I wanted every person in that room to know you were protected," he said. "I wanted you to know it too. You don't know me. I know you fed the strays outside the bakery on your street every morning for 3 years," he said. "Even after your mother told you to stop. I know you learned Mandarin to read one novel that hadn't been translated yet." He set down the mug. "I know you, Nicole." She didn't have an answer for that. She reached across the table for her own cup and their fingers crossed in passing. A half-second of contact, skin against skin. The heat was instant, silver bright and electric, racing up her wrist. She pulled back and said nothing, attributed it firmly to static. Across the table, Jon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He picked up his coffee. He said nothing either. Not yet. The call came on a Wednesday just past 11 at night. Nicole had been in the kitchen making tea she didn't particularly want, which had become her late-night ritual. Something to do with her hands while the estate settled around her into its deep mountain quiet. She had the kettle on and her phone face up on the counter when Diana's name appeared on the screen, and she stood there for 2 full rings deciding whether to answer. She answered. Old reflex. 14 years of conditioning does not dissolve in a week. "I've seen the photographs." Diana's voice was silk pulled tight over something that wanted very badly to tear. She had clearly been waiting to make this call and had spent the waiting time constructing a tone of calm, and the construction was impeccable, and underneath it Nicole could hear the shaking. "Online. There are photographs of that estate, Nicole. Aerial photographs." Nicole said nothing. She poured the water over the tea bag and watched the color bloom. "Do you understand what you've done?" Diana continued. "Do you understand what you're sitting in the middle of? That property is worth the land alone. A breath, a recalibration. This was not the arrangement. You were a convenience, placeholder. I made a practical decision in a difficult moment, and you have taken extraordinary advantage of it." "I haven't done anything," Nicole said. "I married the man you sent me to marry. Don't be glib. You know exactly what I mean." The silk slipped, just slightly. "You will contact a solicitor in the morning. An annulment at this stage is entirely straightforward. You've been there a week. Step aside gracefully, Nicole, and we can manage this without anyone behaving badly." Nicole looked at her tea, at the counter, at the dark window above the sink where the mountain was a deeper black against the black sky. "No," she said. "Silence. I beg your pardon."
No.
The word was steady. It was quiet. It did not shake at all, which surprised her, because her hands were already starting to. "I'm not filing for an annulment. You are throwing away your sisters." "I'm not doing that either." "You are selfish," Diana said, and her voice had shed the silk entirely now, and what was underneath was cold and certain, and had been waiting a long time to say this without the insulation of strategy. "You have always been selfish. Your father was the same. You take and you dress it up as—" Nicole hung up. She set the phone face down on the counter. Her hands were shaking badly now, a fine tremor she couldn't still, and her eyes burned with tears she absolutely refused to let fall because she was 26 years old and she had cried over Diana Bates for the last time some years ago, and she was not starting again in a stranger's kitchen at midnight. She stood very still and breathed and held the mug of tea that had already gone cold. "Nicole." Jon was in the doorway, dark Henley, bare feet on the stone floor, hair disheveled from sleep. He had heard. She could see from his expression that he had heard everything, and she waited for something in her to feel humiliated by that. It didn't come. He crossed the kitchen to her, 2 fingers beneath her chin, tilting her face up. "You said no," he said quietly. She nodded. How did it feel? She thought about it, about her hands shaking, about Diana's voice stripped of its silk, about the word not sitting in her chest right now like something solid and new. "Like breathing," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. He dropped his hand, but he stayed close, and Nicole stood in his warmth with her cold tea and her trembling hands and breathed, carefully, in and out until the shaking stopped. They arrived on a Friday afternoon without warning, which told Nicole everything about how Diana had planned it. The element of surprise as leverage, Vivian as visual argument, the solicitor hovering at the gate as procedural threat. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the library where Nicole was working and said simply, "Your mother is at the gate," with the tone of someone reporting incoming weather. Jon was already in his study. Nicole wasn't sure how he knew, but she had stopped being surprised by the things he knew. She went downstairs. Diana entered the estate the way she entered every room, as though she had personally arranged for it to exist. She was dressed immaculately, her composure fully restored from Wednesday night, the silk back in place and freshly pressed. Vivian followed 3 steps behind in a camel coat with her hair perfect and her face doing the thing it did when she had been given instructions. Present and beautiful and absolutely illegible. The solicitor stayed in the courtyard. Sarah made sure of that. Jon's study was warm and dark-wooded and smelled of old paper and pine, and he was standing when they entered, which Nicole recognized as deliberate. He didn't sit. He didn't offer them seats. He simply stood behind his desk and watched Diana arrange herself in front of it with the patient attention of a man observing a weather system he had already calculated. Diana didn't waste time. Nicole had always grudgingly respected that about her. "Mr. Sheffield." Her voice was warm with manufactured reasonableness. "I'll be direct. The arrangement between our families was intended to unite you with my daughter Vivian. What happened at the chapel was an error of judgment on my part made under pressure, and I take full responsibility. But the fact remains," she gestured toward Vivian with the elegant economy of someone presenting evidence. "Vivian is who you were promised. Nicole was a convenience, placeholder. You are clearly a far more significant man than the rumors suggested, and I cannot in good conscience allow you to be saddled with." She said the word. Jon did not move. That was what made it worse than anger, the absolute absence of reaction in his body, the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop without any visible cause. When he spoke, his voice was low and perfectly level and had nothing in it that could be called emotion, which made it considerably more frightening than if it had. "Say that word about my wife again," he said, "and I will have you removed from this territory, Permanently. By the Pack's authority. Pause. Not by lawyers. Diana's composure held. But only just. Jon turned to Nicole. Tell her what you told her on the phone. Nicole looked at her mother. At the careful construction of her. The architecture of control that had taken decades to build and had shaped Nicole's entire life as a byproduct of its maintenance. She felt something in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was perhaps simply the end of something that had gone on long enough. No, she said. One word. Vivian flinched. Sarah escorted Diana out with a courtesy that left no room for argument. The solicitor's car was heard on the gravel shortly after. Nicole stood in the emptied study and looked at the doorway and found Vivian still in it, one hand on the frame, not quite leaving. Her sister looked at her. Really looked. The way she almost never had. The way Nicole had stopped expecting her to. What Nicole saw stopped her. Not contempt. Not the bored dismissal she had worn so long it had started to look like a feature. Something rawer than that. Something that sat behind Vivian's eyes like an admission she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Envy. And underneath the envy, so new it was barely there, the first hairline crack of shame. Then Vivian was gone. And the gravel sounded again. And Nicole was alone. She made it until midnight. Until the estate was fully quiet and the fire in her room had burned to nothing and the mountain outside her window was just darkness against darkness. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and the thing that had been building since the chapel, since the phone call, since the word her mother had used so easily, came apart all at once. She didn't hear Jon come in. She only knew he was there when the mattress shifted and his arm came around her, solid and warm, and she turned without deciding to and pressed her face against his shoulder and cried. Not quietly, not in the contained, managed way she had always cried in Diana's house. Grief edited down to something that wouldn't inconvenience anyone. Properly. Completely. Everything she had swallowed for years coming up all at once like a tide that had been waiting for the shore to finally hold still. Jon didn't tell her it was all right. He didn't tell her it would pass or that she was fine or any of the things people say when someone else's pain makes them uncomfortable. He held her, steady and immovable as the mountain outside the window, and when the wave finally broke and she was sitting in the wreckage of it, exhausted and emptied and oddly lighter than she'd felt in years, he spoke. You're brave, he said quietly. I want you to know that. Nicole said nothing. She stayed where she was, her face against his shoulder, and let herself believe it. The dreams began the night after Diana left. Nicole was running. Not the labored, leg-won't-move running of ordinary dreams, but something else entirely. Low to the ground and blindingly fast. The snow a white blur beneath four paws. The cold air opening up her lungs like she had never in her life taken a full breath before this. The forest streamed past on either side. The mountain was above her, vast and familiar, and the howl that left her throat was not a scream and not a cry but something clear and silver and resonant. A bell struck in an empty cathedral. She woke feeling better than she had in years. Possibly ever. The second night, the woman appeared. She was running ahead of Nicole through the snow, silver-white, enormous, moving with a fluid certainty that made the forest part for her like water. She stopped in a clearing and turned, and her eyes were amber and calm and very old, and she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence said it with a clarity that no words could have managed. You are not what they told you. Nicole woke with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat, fast and certain. She found Jon in the training yard before breakfast. Tell me what I am, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he set down what he was carrying and gave her his full attention, which was the thing he always did, she had noticed. When she spoke, he stopped everything else, as though what she said was the only thing currently happening in the world. Your father, he said, was born of the silver wolf lineage. She held very still. It is the rarest bloodline in existence. There were perhaps a dozen documented in the last 2 centuries. He said it carefully, watching her face. Your mother discovered it after your father died. She had known something was different about him, but not the extent of it, not until she found his records. And she buried it. All of it. Because a daughter with a claim to Silverwolf blood was a daughter who existed in a world Diana could not control. Nicole thought about the ring. The wolf's head worn smooth. Diana's hand removing it before the funeral. She took his ring, Nicole said. Yes. She took it so I wouldn't have it. So I wouldn't ask questions. Yes. The cold of the training yard settled around her. She breathed it in. The wolf inside you has been dormant, Jon continued, bound by years of being made small. It has been waking since you arrived here, since you came into the territory. Pause. Since you came to me. And you, Nicole said. When did you know? 2 years ago. Sarah brought me a file background on the Bates family routine intelligence. Your name was in it. Your photograph. He held her gaze. I knew within 30 seconds. The mate bond is not subtle. You built this entire thing. The rumors, the arrangement, every piece of it. Because every conventional path to you went through your mother, and your mother would have sold that access to whoever offered the most useful return. His voice was even. I was not willing to be outbid. Nicole looked at him for a long moment. Then, show me. He understood immediately. He took 3 steps back and the shift came. Not slowly, not violently, but with a sudden enormous certainty. And where Jon Sheffield had been standing there was now a wolf the size of something that should not exist. Black as the mountain at midnight. Storm-gray eyes unchanged. Steady and devoted. Watching her face for her reaction. She crossed the distance between them. She reached out and pressed her palm against his muzzle. The fur dense and impossibly warm beneath her hand. Jon Sheffield, alpha of the Ashwood pack, closed his eyes, like it was the greatest gift he had ever been given. Nicole stood in the cold training yard with her hand against the wolf's face and felt something deep in her blood shift, turn over, and begin very slowly to wake. The full moon rose over the Ashwood mountain like something that had been waiting for permission. Nicole felt it before she saw it. A pressure building beneath her skin since sundown. The silver heat that had been quietly accumulating for weeks suddenly urgent, suddenly insistent, her blood running hot and fast in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. By the time Sarah led her out to the mountain meadow, the pack already gathered in a wide silent circle around its edges. She felt incandescent, like something was pressing outward from inside her, patient and enormous, testing every seam. The pack was still in the way that wild things are still. Not absence of movement, presence without distraction. Dozens of them, some in human form, most not, their breath rising in small silver clouds in the moonlit air. Jon stood at the center of the meadow and he was still himself, dark, steady, watching her cross the snow toward him with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of relief. She stopped in front of him. The heat was extraordinary now. Her hands were shaking and it wasn't cold and it wasn't fear. Exactly. Though it lived next to fear the way lightning lives next to thunder. I don't know how, she said. I know. He stepped closer. His voice dropped to something private in the vast cold air. You don't need to know how. You just need to stop holding on. Holding on to what? He looked at her steadily. Everything they told you that you were. Nicole stood with the moon enormous overhead and the pack silent at the edges and the silver heat building past any point she had a word for. And she thought about 14 years of making herself smaller. Of standing in the background of photographs. Of the practical one and the convenient one and filler. Spat from her mother's mouth like something distasteful. She thought about the ring Diana had taken. The records Diana had buried. The wolf in her blood that had been waiting in the dark for 26 years because no one had ever told it that it was allowed to exist. She stopped holding on. The sound left her throat first. Long and silver and ringing. Nothing like a scream. Nothing like a human voice. Something that the meadow caught and the mountain caught and sent back from every direction at once. Then the shift came and it was not violence and it was not pain. It was the particular physical sensation of a door blown open by a gale that had been building for a very long time on the other side. She opened her eyes. The world was different, richer. The snow was 1,000 textures, the air a library of information, the moonlight almost unbearably beautiful. She looked down at herself and saw silver. Not white silver, the color of her father's ring, of the sigil above every Sheffield door, of the woman in her dreams running through the snow with amber eyes and the absolute certainty of something that has always known what it is. The pack went still. Then, from the edges of the meadow, one by one, every wolf lay down, heads to paws, unhurried and complete. Sarah stood at the tree-line with her hand pressed over her mouth, and when she lowered it her voice was barely sound at all. The silver Luna. A breath. She actually came back. Jon's black wolf moved to her side and pressed his flank against hers, warm and solid and immovable. And through the place in her chest where the mate bond lived came not words but something that contained everything words had ever been invented to approximate. She leaned into him. They ran. The pack rose and followed, streaming across the snow-covered meadow and into the trees, and the mountain took their voices and held them, long after the meadow was empty and still. Diana Bates had always been a woman who knew how to find the right tool for a problem. Nicole understood this later, piecing it together from what Sarah told her, from the documents the pack's contacts recovered, from the cold arithmetic of her mother's logic made visible. Diana had not acted in rage. Rage was imprecise. Diana had assessed the situation with the same optimizing intelligence she applied to everything, identified the variable she needed to move, and found the people most motivated to move it. The Voss faction had wanted Ashwood territory for 30 years. Diana had wanted her daughter removed from it. The overlap was, from a purely transactional standpoint, elegant. She had provided them with estate schematics obtained through the solicitor's preliminary access requests, security rotation schedules, and the intelligence she considered most valuable. Jon Sheffield's mate was a human woman with no power, no training, and no value as a combatant. A liability, point of leverage. Diana had not known about the silver wolf. She had buried that truth so thoroughly that she had, apparently, forgotten what she'd buried. The Voss faction moved on a moonless night, 11 days after the full moon. Midnight, coordinated entry points, disciplined formation, the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before and expected it to be straightforward. Nicole was already in the courtyard when they came through the gate. She had felt them coming the way she had learned in 11 days to feel most things, through the territory itself, through some channel of awareness that had been closed her entire life and was now simply open. She had woken Sarah first. Sarah had woken the pack. Jon had looked at Nicole across the dark hallway outside their room and said, with complete calm, "Stay close?" And Nicole had said, "I intend to," which was not exactly what he had meant but was the truth. The Voss wolves entered the courtyard and stopped. The Ashwood pack was arranged in a wide arc across the stone, and at the center of it, silver in the darkness without any moon to account for the light, was Nicole. Her own illumination, her father's bloodline with nowhere left to hide. Jon's law held. No provocation. No advance. The Ashwood pack stood its ground with the immovable patience of people who knew the difference between strength and aggression and had never needed to confuse the two. The Voss Alpha moved anyway, not toward Nicole. Toward Jon, a calculation the head of the beast, and for one fraction of a second the trajectory was clear and uncontested. Nicole moved faster. She intercepted without thinking, which was the truest thing she had ever done. No strategy, no considered decision, just the mate bond incandescent in her chest and the absolute refusal, cellular and total, to allow anything in this world to take him from her. Her silver form hit the space between them like a weather event, and the fury that came through her was not rage, not panic, but something older and more deliberate than either. The Voss Alpha stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered his head. The retreat was swift and complete. The Voss faction moved back through the gate and into the dark, and the courtyard exhaled. The documentation was filed with the Regional Supernatural Council before dawn. Bank transfers, communications, estate schematics with Diana Bates's solicitor's fingerprints on every page. Comprehensive. Irrefutable. Sarah handed Nicole the file as the sun came up over the mountain, and Nicole held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then she signed her name at the bottom of the submission. Nicole Sheffield. The first time she had written it. It looked, she thought, exactly right. The council's judgment came down 12 days after the submission, which Sarah said was fast, which told Nicole how clean the evidence had been. Diana Bates was exiled from the Northern Territories, a designation that carried legal weight in both the supernatural governance structure and, through mechanisms Nicole was still learning to understand, the human legal apparatus that ran parallel to it. Criminal liability for the alliance, for the provision of intelligence to a hostile faction, for the deliberate targeting of a Pac Luna. The social architecture Diana had spent her entire adult life constructing, the connections, the carefully maintained position, the identity she had sacrificed her younger daughter to protect, came down with the kind of swift, total efficiency that Diana herself would have appreciated in other circumstances. Nicole received the notification by secure document. She read it once, set it on the kitchen table, and made herself a cup of tea that she actually drank while it was still warm. Then she went to train with Sarah because she had a lesson scheduled and she had learned, in this life she was building, to keep her commitments. Vivian called on a Thursday evening. Nicole almost didn't answer. Then she did because she was trying to stop making decisions based on old fear. "I'm not calling to apologies." Vivian's voice was stripped of its usual performance. Something underneath it that Nicole recognized as the sound of someone speaking without having fully rehearsed what they were going to say. I'm not ready for that yet. I know that's not good enough." "All right," Nicole said. "I want to understand what you are, what I missed." A pause. "Can I come?" "Not to take anything. I'm not. I just want to see." Nicole stood in the courtyard with the mountain at her back and thought about the hairline crack of shame she had seen in Vivian's eyes the day Diana was escorted out. About the fact that making that call had cost her sister something, and she had made it anyway. "Yes," she said, not from obligation, from the possibility that Vivian, stripped of Diana's scaffolding, might be someone she had never actually had the chance to meet. The weeks folded into each other with the particular richness of a life that had been gray for a long time and was now, incrementally, filling with color. She trained with Sarah every morning, learning to shift with control, to move through the territory with intention, to understand the Pac's governance and her place within it. She read. The Ashwood Library was vast and she was systematic, working through the history in chronological order. And it was on a Tuesday evening in the third week that she found her father's name. Robert Bates, Silver Wolf ally.
Ashwood Accord, 1997.
Paragraph. A notation in the margin in different ink, older. Conducted himself with complete honor. She sat with it for a long time. Jon came in at some point and sat beside her without asking what she'd found, because he could see what page she was on and he already knew. They stayed like that in silence long enough for the fire to shift and settle. "He would have been proud of you," Jon said quietly. Nicole pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed him in. Pine and cold stone and the warmth that she had stopped finding surprising, and let that sit in her chest alongside her father's name in the margin of a book that had been here for decades, waiting for her to find it. "I love you," she said, not carefully. Not as something fragile being offered for inspection. As a fact she was simply done not saying out loud. "And I'm not going anywhere. Not because of the bond. Because I choose this. Every single day." Jon turned to her and she saw in his face all of it. The 2 years of searching, the careful architecture of the plan he had built to reach her. The patience of a man who had known and had waited and had never once allowed himself to be certain it would work out. He kissed her with all of that behind it. The mate bond blazed through her chest like the silver wolf mid-run, like the mountain catching a howl and holding it, like every door she had ever been locked out of opening all at once. Jon asked her on the night of the winter solstice, which she suspected was not accidental. He found her in the library, her library now. She had started thinking of it that way without noticing, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, which was his habit when he had decided to say something that mattered. "The first time was a transaction," he said. "I don't regret it. It got you here. But I want to do it again." A pause. "Properly. With the pack as witness under the full moon. I want it to be everything this time." Nicole looked at him across the room and thought about St. Aldrich's Chapel and the dress that didn't fit and her mother's voice through a thin wall, efficient and cold. She thought about walking that aisle with her hands freezing and her heart in her throat toward a stranger who had not, it turned out, been a stranger at all. "Yes," she said. The same word she always came back to with him. Kept being the truest one available. Sarah found the pendant in the estate archives 3 days later. Her father's, catalogued in 1997 alongside his name in the margin of the Accord record. A silver disc, a wolf's head, the twin of the ring Diana had taken. Sarah placed it in Nicole's hand without ceremony, and Nicole stood in the archive room and held it until it was warm. She wore it on the solstice, against her collarbone, beneath the dress she had chosen herself. Simple, dark, nothing borrowed, nothing that had ever belonged to anyone else. The mountain meadow had been transformed. Torches driven into the snow at intervals, burning amber and steady in the still cold air. The pack stood in a wide circle, breath rising in small silver clouds. The moon so enormous overhead it seemed impossible, seemed close enough to reach. Nicole stood at the meadow's edge and looked at the length of snow between her and the man waiting at its center and thought. Every wrong turn, every single one. She walked barefoot. The snow was cold and clean beneath her feet, and she didn't hurry. Jon's face when she reached him was the thing she would carry longest. All of it visible for once, without the careful management. The searching, the relief, the absolute and irrevocable nature of what he felt. "You are not mine because you were delivered to me," he said. "You are mine because you stayed, because you fought, because you looked at the wolf and said, 'Show me.'" His voice was steady but only just. "I will spend my life being worth that courage." Nicole took a breath of cold solstice air and spoke to him and to the mountain and to the pack and to the woman with silver fur and amber eyes who ran through her dreams. "I was told my whole life that I was the wrong one. The wrong daughter in the wrong place with the wrong future. I believe now that every wrong turn brought me here. To you. To this pack. To myself." She felt the mate bond warm and blazing in her chest. Felt the silver wolf wide awake and listening. "I vow to never shrink again. I vow to be exactly, furiously, completely who I am. Yours. And mine. Equally." Sarah's voice rose into the night, clear and carrying. "The silver Luna has spoken. The pack bears witness." One howl began, then 10. Then the entire mountain was singing. Jon and Nicole shifted together. Black wolf and silver wolf, the alpha and the Luna, shadow and moonlight, and ran into the forest, the pack streaming behind them across the snow like a river that had finally found its course. The mountain held their howl long after the meadow was empty. Long after the torches had burned to nothing and the snow had smoothed over every footprint and the solstice moon had begun its long arc toward dawn. For every woman who was ever handed to someone as a substitute, as a stand-in, as the wrong one, this story belongs to you. Because sometimes the ones they threw away are the ones the world was never ready to handle. Until now.